So once again, happy 2025.
Happy 2025.
Yeah, good morning, Momentum. Happy New Year. I think everyone this morning has asked me how our trip was, so you know that we were out for a little spell. The last time we were here was before this occurrence. I don't know if you recognize this, but this was like the Monday before Christmas. So, right, New Year's was Wednesday, Christmas was Wednesday, Christmas Eve was Tuesday. So this was the Monday, the day before Christmas Eve. And if you did not see this, this was like a video that's going all over the internet in a hot minute, really. Amazingly large wave up in Northern California. I don't know what it was with that Monday, but there, am I on?
Yep.
Okay, I am. But it was just, all of these waves were like crashing into Northern California just that morning. And that morning, up in Santa Cruz in particular, this wave hit the Santa Cruz pier and just sheared the whole thing in half. Like the whole end came off. And the footage was captivating. How the whole end of this pier like broke off, started to go out to sea, and because of the waves coming in, like then the whole end of the pier started coming back to the shore. It was super dangerous. And it was an impressive visual. But what impressed me about this clip was not just all of this. Look, you know one of those little, what do you call them, bobcats? It was on the pier. And so there's this bobcat like floating out in the water for the longest time. You see the waves hitting it, and it never fell off for some reason. But what really impressed me about this clip after watching it wasn't the clip itself, but the comment section. Because I went to this like right when it came out, and there were all these different reactions to this footage. Some people wondered if this clip was just like a regurgitated thing, like somewhere like, oh, this was an old clip, I saw this like months and months ago, and they're just doing this for clicks. You know, someone resurrected it. Other people traced the clip back to this tsunami like years ago in Asia. And I'm like, clearly this is not Asia. I don't know why you're talking about that. Yeah. And some people had all kinds of conspiracy theories as to why is this clip here? Like, where did it come from? What's the agenda? You know, is there some sort of environmental agenda? They're just making this up. And this is crazy, but there's a whole contingent of people who are like, I don't think this happened at all. I don't know how you make something like that up on AI, but maybe they thought, oh, they just made it up. Of course, because of all of this, I had to immediately do some brief research, and I looked on all the different websites and all the news channels, and I confirmed this actually did happen in Santa Cruz. In fact, 3 construction workers were on this pier when it went into the water. And miraculously, 2 of them, minor injuries, and they were rescued. But even more miraculously, the 3rd guy was on this pier. Like, it sunk like 30 feet into the water, and he was just riding it, and then he jumps off and he swims to shore. Like, if he got hit by any of those pieces, he would be dead. But he jumps off and he just, that was my day, right? But increasingly, really, this is what we need to do with all the things that show up in our lives, right? We see the news, or we get sent an article, or a video, or a picture, and we have to go out and we have to do our own research to confirm that this actually happens. You know, double check the sources. See if the Nigerian prince really does want to wire us $1 million. Just, you know, all he needs is your social security number and your banking information. He'll wire it right to you. But it goes to show us, this is the kind of world that we're accustomed to now. Liars and lies, and people kind of even deceiving themselves are everywhere. And they're so very good at either self-deception or making up hoaxes. You know, the internet can just, the fog of war of the internet, just, you can make anything up. So people call into question everything and whether or not the whole, whatever event happened, really happened. Especially, golly, you know, just this last like few months, There's this lady who showed up on my feed. She's like, oh, don't cook with tin foil. I'm like, I've been cooking with aluminum foil all my life. Like, am I going to die tomorrow? And this was, again, for like a week. It was like, oh yeah, you're killing yourself. It's going to leach into your body. You're going to be an idiot because all the metal's in you. And then like 2 weeks later, someone comes online and says, oh no, she didn't know what she's talking about. And then, I don't know if you remember, like 3 months ago, there was a huge article on throw away your black spatulas. Did you see that? Right? Everybody was like, oh, the black plastic is full of bad stuff. I don't know if you saw it. Not 3 weeks after that, one article comes out by the actual scientific journal that fact-checked this, and they said, oh yeah, they were off by a factor of 2. And so you don't really have poison in your black plastic stuff. We're kicking these guys out of the scientific community because they really didn't get it right. They got the data wrong, right? So you probably threw away your stuff, but go into your trash, get your spatula back. But yeah, truth is elusive and it's difficult. And knowing is elusive and difficult, especially in our age. Who's telling the truth? Who's constructing an elaborate hoax upon you? As we start our new year, we're starting a whole new series in the book of 1 John. 1 John, this letter from the oldest and the last of the disciples of Jesus, John, to a group of churches in Asia Minor. And this book, finding and knowing the truth and living in the truth of Christ, right? Living out this life of Jesus. It's not only the theme of the whole book, but in particular our introduction today. So, major topic for our opening passage. So if you've got your Bibles, turn with me to 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. 1 John 1, 1 through 4. Of course, as we always say, you can find the passage in your bulletin as well. You can just follow up here with the PowerPoint too. This is the disciple John, 1 John 1, 1 through 4. And he opens this letter and he writes to us this. He says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we've seen with our eyes, what we've looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And the life was manifested. And we have seen and testify and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. Little, right? Little passage, but really packed. As we do, we always begin with an understanding of our context, the author, what they're all about, the passage, shedding light on these verses in terms of our understanding. And we should be pretty familiar with the context of this letter already, since it's very much like the Gospel of John, his book that this biography that he wrote, which we studied for our whole Advent series last year. Same gospel, same John, same author. So if you remember, John, our author, is the last of the original disciples, these 12 chosen followers of Jesus, specially appointed by him, who had seen him, who had walked with him, were commissioned by Jesus. But now, this is the end of the first century. And John writes this letter probably anywhere from like 90 AD to 98 AD, like the very tail end of the first century. So, if you do your math, if John were, let's assume like 20 years old. A lot of people think that he was around 20 years old when he starts to follow Jesus. He might be at this point in time when he's authoring this letter, 70, 78, maybe a little bit older. Some think that he might be, maybe in his 80s. But he is, by all accounts, the elder statesperson of the church. Right? He's like the top of the heap. So, as such, John is writing a church which is largely younger than he is. And at this time, it's a church that's rather prone to drifting away from the facts about Christ. It's been many generations from the actual life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, right? It's like 60 years. So if you think about that, it's 2025, right? What's 60 years before now? It's like 65, right? 1965. 1965, something like that. That was when, that's 60 years ago when, like, the events of Jesus' death and resurrection. And so, yes, there's some of us who were around back then, but not as many as there, right? So, as such, John's writing this church that's much younger. And if you remember, there were two cultic movements pulling people away from the teachings of Jesus. The first was, we call it Gnosticism. It was really something like, Gnosticism was really more fully formed in the 2nd century. In the 1st century, we call it something like proto-Gnosticism. But Gnosticism, or proto-Gnosticism, was this highly like dualistic belief. All physical things were evil, all desires are evil, only like the invisible world is good, all the spiritual things. So Gnosticism was kind of anti-joy, kind of anti-enjoyment. You can't enjoy anything here because this stuff is bad. Anything experienced in our bodies was cursed, it's evil, and so they taught that Jesus himself couldn't be flesh and blood, because that would mean that he would be evil and he would be tainted. So Gnosticism appealed to people who are big on rules and self-denial. That's what made you spiritual, to get yourself out of this world, right? It's not rooted really in what the Bible teaches about God. God creates good things and a good creation, and he desires us to experience joy, not just in the afterlife, but here too, and appreciate what he provides for us. That's Gnosticism. Gnosticism's kind of crazy cousin was Corinthianism. We talked about this as well, founded by Corinthus, who we learn a contemporary of John. This was the second false teaching of the day. Corinthus taught that Jesus wasn't born the Son of God. Jesus was just a guy, right? He's just born, no virgin birth. He's born the son of Joseph and Mary. None of this Christmas miracle business. He's just a guy. But upon his baptism, he gets infused with this supernatural being. So there's no real unity of Jesus. He's kind of two different people. And so Corinthus denies the full deity and the full humanity of Jesus because he denies the unity of Jesus. He teaches that Jesus is basically two beings instead of one. And this denies all the necessary qualities that Jesus would need to be in order to be what we talked about, our atoning sacrifice that we talked about throughout our whole Christmas series. So this is the lay of the land, the context of the last years of the 1st century. John is this last bastion of truth where people in the church, they're being led astray left and right from the foundational tenets and the vital truths that give to us our full faith in Jesus. People don't know the truth, so they're straying, being deceived, following the newest and the most attractive trend of the day, whether it's Gnosticism or Corinthianism or whatever pops up. So John writes the church throughout Asia Minor this letter, 1 John, in order to remind them, call them back to the truth taught about Christ, to lead them to the powerfully joyful life that we can have following Jesus. But, and John recognizes this, so how do we know these truths to be true, right? How do we know that John is even able to teach us truth? Is truth even knowable? That's our passage today. John opens with 3 ways we can know that the letter that John is writing is the truth about Christ. And that truth is knowable. John instructs us with 3 guideposts in particular that confirm his teachings. The first is simple, and that is that his letter will return us to founding principles. He's going to return us to founding principles. This is what John teaches. This is what truth is going to do. It will always return you to paths that are tried and true. That what John is going to teach is not something that you've never heard before, but truth that you're already familiar with. Truth that's been tested and confirmed. We're going to hear this throughout the book of 1 John, that you already know this. I'm repeating it to you again. Founding principles. This is why the first phrase that John writes is this: what was from the beginning. First thing out of his mouth. This ought to be a familiar phrase to us. And John wants it to be familiar to us, because this opening phrase echoes John's more famous work that we're familiar with because we studied it over Christmas, right? The book of John, his biography of Jesus, where John began that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's like an echo of 1 John here. That opening phrase John wrote in order to mimic the even more familiar verse that we know about, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the very first sentence of the Bible, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, John chapter 1, verse 1. They're both written to encourage full allegiance to God, right? Our whole loyalty to God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 was written to remind the Israelites, if your God is the creator God, is the first only God out there, there's no reason to follow the other gods of the pantheons of Egypt or Greece or all those gods. No, because God created all those things, right? The God of frogs, the God of the river, right? God's the creator of everything. He's number one. No reason to stray. So what does John do in response to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1? John picks up on that and he says, hey, by the way, New Testament believers, the Jesus that I'm talking about, he's the God of the Old Testament. Jesus was the creator in the beginning as well. The Word was God. The Word became flesh. Here, in 1 John, John picks up on that theme and he's saying, hey, what I'm going to teach you in this letter is one with that body of truth. My letter and all truth is going to return you to the beginning. Fundamental things. Things that you already know about the Creator God. Beginning truths that you feel like you already know about, like Jesus, why Jesus has come, why do we react to the history of Jesus' life, about his birth and his teaching, his death, his resurrection. So this is John's assertion about the nature of truth, really. How to test truth. This is how his letter is going to be confirmed as true. He says, first, the truth returns us to founding principles. If it's new and foreign and attractive just for being new and foreign, well, it's not from the beginning. God's been teaching us about himself from day one, so all truth should resonate with things that we've already seen about God over the thousands of years that he's revealed himself to us. So, now John's second point about why his letter will be proven true is this. It listens to primary sources. And that's what truth does. It listens to primary sources. Follows, understands the testimony of people who were there and saw and experienced everything that they teach about. What are those primary sources? Well, people like John. And the other apostles, right? The 12 disciples of Jesus. John continues this introduction. And he says, what was from the beginning? What we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And the life was manifested, and we have seen and testify and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we've seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you too may have fellowship with us. It's not just a flowery introduction on the part of John. This is John forming the reason why you should read the rest of his letter and believe what he is saying rather than somebody else. John says, believe what I teach because I was there. In the first century, when this was written, as we've said, John may have been part of a generation of people who were slowly passing away. People who had actually seen and been with and heard the teaching of Jesus firsthand. John says, we heard it. We saw it ourselves with our own eyes. We touched all of these things concerning the word of life, concerning Jesus, this whole narrative concerning eternal life. The we being John and this generation, but probably the apostles, right? John proclaims these things authoritatively because he is a first-person witness. In a culture without newspapers, which is kind of our culture now. No, okay, but a culture without the internet, without video, without other things, right? we were on vacation, they delivered a newspaper to our hotel room. I'm like, what's this? This is my hands dirty. But our culture now, right? We depend on videos and internet and all this other things. This is a culture without all of that technology, where written words and written records were precious and few and far between. This is the standard, the gold standard, to hear news from and hear teaching from and hear history from someone who actually experiences the events. You couldn't get better than that. And all of these other false teachers, what are their sources? They're just making things up, like sitting down and thinking, oh, well, what do I think the world's all about? Teaching what they think is correct and what they believe is a proper worldview. But John, no, his teaching is based on direct experience with the Son of God. He's sat at the feet of Jesus. He's seen the death of Christ. He's experienced the love of Jesus, the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus into heaven. John has the credentials and the testimony to powerfully relate these are the central truths of Jesus, from Jesus, about living life in Jesus. Why? Because he was there. So, what makes the teaching of John believable and true? Well, first, primary source, and also we are able to recognize his teaching as being from the beginning, founding principles. His third point, and how do we know the truth? Well, founding principles, primary sources. He's got these proven motives. We should be following proven motives. That John has no ulterior motive of like gathering a following for himself or earning financial advantage or being seen as a guru or philosophical expert. And he doesn't have all of this baggage. John says, check my motive, watch my lifestyle, trace what he and the other apostles have been all about. Why does John teach what he teaches? We proclaim to you also that you too may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son Jesus Christ. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. John says, we're believable because what we teach about is all about one thing. It gives us joy to see people united with God. We proclaim so that you have fellowship with us, and our fellowship really means having fellowship with God the Father and God the Son. The apostles, they all died martyrs. They died poor. They died powerless. And all about one thing, that more people understood the message of Jesus and experienced a transformed life through the forgiveness of Christ, joyfully entering into a life lived with Jesus. Now, you could point at leaders of the movements of Gnosticism, Proto-Gnosticism, or Corinthianism, whatever, right? They might seem well-meaning, but movements that are all about rules and do's and don'ts all eventually put power into the hands of the people who make up all the do's and don'ts. And eventually, you're following them. And so you're under their thumb. The disciples provided a path to Jesus and Jesus' commands and life with Jesus, where we all follow Jesus together. And no one lords it over one another, but we all rejoice in the mutual forgiveness and the mutual life that we experience together, the mutual path we walk as Christ leads us. And that's powerful proof that the apostles were not teaching for themselves, or for a following, or for popularity, or for position, or for the big car that you see that, person in ministry driving around, right? They taught for the joy that it brings to see truth go out. And truth powerfully connect people to Jesus himself. So is truth knowable? John says yes, truth is knowable. And we can know truth, not just because John says, because I say so, but from all these different sources. From the historic thread of tried and true, tested biblical principles that God's people have experienced throughout the centuries, through the current eyewitness testimony of the apostles, giving the actual teaching and the actual history and the actual acts of Jesus, and through the confirmed, just life, right? The living example of the disciples who are living and dying to connect people with Jesus. Any of those sources of truth are pretty convincing. John says, look, all the data points, they'll point you to the conclusion of the trustworthy nature of the teachings about Jesus that are about to come in the book of 1 John. So, that's our brief introduction to 1 John. What does it teach us about truth? And how Christ brings us his principles and his teaching and himself into our lives? Well, yes, truth is knowable, but how do we apply that? In our environment of cynicism, in our environment of skepticism and conspiracy theories, and lots of false things out there, and doubts, how does John's introduction impact the knowability of truth? First application is pretty clear, and that is grow deeper in truth. Grow deeper in truth. That if you want to know the truth, right, true things, it's just getting deeper. If you want to learn and expand in what's true and live more according to what's right, realize that the pursuit of truth is not discovering new trends and experiences. Truth comes to knowing the most important beginning things in a more deep way. Plumbing all the points of Jesus' life and his death and his sacrifice, his teaching, his resurrection, how the news of Jesus impacts and changes us and calls us to respond to him. Thinking deeply on the perfections of God. Who is God? How does he joyfully save us? Just think about the basic points of what we know as the good news, right? The gospel of Jesus Christ. The most basic points are super, super simple. First one, well, who's God, right? That's the beginning point. Who's God himself? His omniscience, his omnipotence, his justice, his kindness, his creative power, his wisdom, how everything is made by him to glorify him. He's got a plan. Everything's made to reflect him and who he is. That's the starting point of the gospel, right? The good news of Jesus. And from knowing God, the second basic of the gospel is just this. Well, how then does God interact with us? Humanity, all of us. In our sinful imperfection, how we deserve punishment, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, how we are not full of gratitude and we lack faith. Instead of following the route of punishing us for forever, God so loves the world that he sends Jesus, God taking on humanity. So that when Jesus lives and when Jesus teaches and Jesus eventually is rejected and is tortured and killed, Jesus' life ransoms our lives. His life pays the penalty that we deserve because of this amazing supernatural exchange that goes on, where Jesus gives to us his life and his death. And we know that leads us to the third basic, and that's simply how we respond. We need to say yes. We need to say, oh yeah, I recognize that God gives us the gift of Jesus and his life and his forgiveness. Our response, where God gives to us forgiveness, we have to say, oh, I acknowledge that forgiveness. Where God has loved us, we need to acknowledge, God's loved me. Where God has given to us a new life, we live and thankfully respond to that new life. It's just the basics. And everything that you have ever need to know to live in Christ is attached to one of these basics. Deepens our understanding of one of these basics. Helps us to live out one of these basics. Every book that you have read that you thought, wow, that's profound, it's just an elaboration of one of these basics. Every speaker that you've listened to that you've gone, wow, that's transformational. That's one of these truths. Every principle of living that has changed you, it's somehow connected one of these three. Who is God? What has Christ done? How do I respond? God, Jesus, response. God, Jesus, response. It's nothing new, just deeper in the things that we already know. Well, if you are a Southern Californian, this should not be a challenge to you. Or if you know basketball, you should know this man, right? Who is John Wooden? Everybody knows. You should know John Wooden. He is the winningest coach. Is that a word? Winningest? Yes, he's the winningest coach in all college basketball. His team, we won't mention the school, but his team won 10 national championships. Basketball person, you might go, oh, big deal. The closest other coach to win as 4 national championships This man won 10 of them. Some coaches struggle to win one. Won 10 of them. So, even if you have just the briefest knowledge of who John Wooden is, you know that he was famous for teaching that each and every one of his players needed to know the basics. The most basic things that counted. That if you mastered the first things that a player ought to learn in your very first few basketball lessons, it could take you to the greatest successes. One article which ranked Wooden as the greatest college coach of all time says this. It says, Wooden believed patience, poise, and mastery of the basic fundamentals of one's craft were essential to being world class. His 10 national championships and 12 years, including 7 in a row, are a testament to his belief system. So, Coach Wooden, they just called him Coach, right? Was so convinced that the most basic things that were the most important. His first lesson that he taught all of his players, as they come to their very first practice, even if they were sophomores, juniors, seniors, the very first practice, he would get these like very famous, almost jaded people in, right? They were heavily recruited. And he would teach them not really one thing, 2 things. First, how to put on your socks. He was famous for this. They would come and they would be like, okay, coach, teach us. He would say, take your shoes off. I'm going to teach you how to put your socks on. And they're like, wait, all these other schools want me. I'm super famous. I'm like a superstar. And you want to teach me how to put my socks on? Yeah. He walks them through this perfect method that he devised to put on socks so they would be tight all of the time. And when they were tight throughout the whole game, they didn't bunch up. And when they didn't bunch up, they didn't cause blisters. And when they didn't cause blisters, they didn't cause that kind of uncomfortable, right, legacy that would go from game to game and had to be treated. So his team never had blisters because he taught them how to put their socks on right. Whereas other teams were struggling with that. And then he taught them how to put their shoes on. Each player was taught this special method. So, you're watching a basketball game. How many times do you see guys bending over, tying their shoes? All the time. And it disrupts their rhythm. No one on his teams had to retie their shoes because he taught them how to tie their shoes. Seems ridiculous. Here, these are grown men. Well, 18-year-olds. Yes, grown men. We'll affirm that. You're supposed to learn these things when you're like 4, 5, or 3, I don't know. And returning to the things that they thought they had mastered. But Wooden was teaching them is going back to the most basic things. Going deeper, that is the priority. And this is what John is doing. John's saying, come back to the beginning, to the person of God, to the work of Jesus, to how you respond over and over and over again. Maybe in your new year. Maybe not adding that one more thing to your resolutions, but deepening in what you already know. Focusing, being less distracted by the new or the extra. Concentrating on what you already have and have learned and applying it. Application number 1, grow deeper in truth. Application number 2, grow together in joy. This is how we know truth. It's joyful. It's a joyful journey together. That we know we're going in the right direction with the right people who are leading us in the right paths because our focus together is joyful. Because we're growing toward Christ and growing in our understanding of living as Christ leads us. So being part of a community of friends. You could be a part of a small group here at Momentum. We have lots of different small. You can go to the welcome table, you sign up with a small group, or the core class on the Sunday mornings, or a Tuesday night Bible study, or just get a prayer partner, where it's clear that the purpose of this relationship is this joyful journey together where we mutually draw close to God, which brings us closer to one another. Or as John says, right, that you too may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. These things we write so that our joy may be made complete. These kind of relationships are the kind of pole stars that guide us to the truth, where we're traveling towards Jesus and encouraging one another in our journey in that direction. All that takes is, it's not much. It's just getting together with someone, with a group of people, praying together, sharing together, pointing each other towards the will of Jesus. Friendships that do not necessarily have to be based on, oh, well, you know, you live next door, or we have this or that in common, or hobbies, or this or that. All you need is this one mutual direction together and concern for pursuing God. And joy, where we rejoice in one another and over one another when God answers a prayer, or when we see ourselves growing in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all those different fruits of the Spirit, or God is teaching us a lesson, or helping us to be patient with other people. Some of you know that our family, well, you all know that our family went away, but when we went away on vacation, right, this is the first vacation where when we traveled and we got to our hotel, I brought out this. Yeah. It looks just like a picture, but if you squint, you can tell that it's a puzzle, right? I actually brought a puzzle on our vacation. I think someone gave us this puzzle a lot of years ago, and it's just been hanging out in our house. And I knew if we put together this puzzle, nobody puts a puzzle together twice, right? So we could get it out of our house. We could put it together and then just give it away. So I'm just trying to get stuff out of our house, right? But this was a 1,000-piece puzzle, and it actually was. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I was like, oh yeah, we'll finish this in the afternoon. 1,000 pieces, not in an afternoon. No, it actually sucked up a good deal of our vacation time. But I gotta say, it was a pretty productive time filler, because instead of, like we go on vacation, in our downtimes, we all retreat to our devices and we all do our video games or whatever we do, right? But puzzling is good family time. I found this out because you look for that one piece. I actually look for these. There's this like really crazy shaped piece, right? That you're like, oh, this should really stand out because it's super crazy shaped. It's like super small. I should just be able to look at the 1,000 pieces and say, there it is. Or like I was looking for baby Jesus for the longest time. I was like, baby Jesus should really stand out. There's no other baby Jesus here. I should be able to look at this pile. Where's baby Jesus? And I was like, oh. And so you turn to your family and you go, oh, I've been looking for this for 15 minutes and it should not be hard. Why is this not hard? Stand up. Is it around somewhere? And then your son or your daughter or your wife says, you mean this? And they just set it right where you wanted it to be. Do you get upset? Do you get impatient or like, oh, you're terrible because you've... No. Everyone goes, yes. Because we're one thousandth of a step closer to our goal mutually together. Hopefully you're in a family like that. We're in a family like that. We all go, oh, yay, finally. We got baby Jesus where baby Jesus is supposed to be. Right? This is the picture that John is showing us. Yeah, we find truth from eyewitnesses and returning to fundamentals, but we travel towards truth together with people who are joyfully going the same way. And they're kind of affirming, this is the right way to go. Deepening with us on the journey, knowing, having fellowship with the Father and the Son, Jesus Christ, is the way we're going. So find that prayer partner, or that small group, or that Bible study. Do that this year, that community. We have a whole list of opportunities at the welcome table. That's how you grow deeper with Jesus. And you find true things, going into the world, sharing his love with those he calls us to.